Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, September 28th, and here's what's on tap this week. Nagorno-Karabakh, a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that started even before the Soviet Union broke up in the late 1980s, is suddenly over, with Azerbaijan taking full control of the breakaway region and dealing yet another blow to Russia's influence in its own near abroad. Then we'll take a look at talks between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel about how to normalize the relationship between the two worthwhile enemies. Those talks are making progress, and we're going to take a look at how far we've gotten and what the issues are that remain. And finally, Ukraine. As fall and winter approach, the weather is likely to interfere with the ongoing fighting in one form or another. So where are we today and what is in store for the next few weeks and months ahead? Here to talk about these issues are the reporters that cover them. Ravi Agrawal is editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Gideon Rachman is senior foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times. And Philp is international correspondent of the Times of London. Welcome all three. Wonderful to see you. Thanks for joining us this week. Ravi, let's start with you. Nagorno-Karabakh, a frozen conflict, suddenly unfrozen, and in some ways over. A really remarkable set of events in just the last few weeks with large-scale refugee flows and all kinds of other things. But it is a very significant development that seems to be caught almost everybody off guard.
It really has. I mean, the Armenians have been warning about just this for quite a while now, but it seems like those warnings have fallen on deaf ears internationally. But as you say, all of this kind of just began on September 19, less than 2 weeks ago. And I should explain a little bit of the context here. So Nagorno-Karabakh was, no longer is, but was a self-governing region enveloped by Azerbaijan. And it has an ethnic Armenian population, and so Armenia claimed the territory. And it's worth pointing out that Karabakh is not formally recognized by any other country. So last week, Azerbaijan launched a pretty big assault on Nagorno-Karabakh, and within pretty much a day, Armenian separatists agreed to lay down their arms. And we're guessing that under duress, they signed a ceasefire agreement, which means that almost immediately this erstwhile self-governing region is essentially dismantled and will assimilate into Azerbaijan. And so cue a flood of ethnic Armenians escaping their homes there, taking whatever belongings they can grab, racing towards Armenia. I believe some half of the 100,000 plus people who used to live in Nagorno-Karabakh have now fled. And it's important to point out, Ivo, that none of this has happened in isolation. So there's the historical context here in that this is a frozen conflict, but it's been simmering over the last few years. I think especially since 2020, that was the last time that Russia brokered a ceasefire between the two sides. And as I said at the start, Armenia's been warning for months that Azerbaijan might try to wrest control of Karabakh, which I should point out the Armenians call Artsakh. Now, Russia, over the last few years, has provided a sort of security blanket to keep this conflict frozen. And it seems like Baku has just taken advantage of a moment where Moscow is increasingly tied up with a very long and protracted war in Ukraine, which I know we'll be discussing later this hour. And there's a great game element to all of this. Armenia does house some Kremlin military bases. Azerbaijan is backed by Turkey. Both of these countries are mineral rich. Azerbaijan in particular has tried to cash in on that by building a pipeline to export its oil and gas south without relying on Russia. And there's also anger in Armenia at the EU, which has failed to mediate so far, also the United States. But spare a thought for Armenia, which is now going to be dealing with a massive refugee crisis, upwards of 100,000 people that it will try to absorb somehow. And this is a country that really just has about 2.5, 2.7 million people or so. And that sort of prospective assimilation has already begun to spark some protests in Yerevan over the leadership of Prime Minister Pashinyan.
Yeah, it's really both a tragedy in terms of the human consequences, Gideon. In some ways, 4% of the population will be added to Armenia all of a sudden, and people who really have nothing. But it's also this larger geopolitical game with Turkey, of course, backing Azerbaijan and Russia backing Armenia. And it seems that the balance of power just has shifted quite a bit in the region, Gideon.
Yeah, no, it does look like that. I mean, the sort of Turkish-Russian relationship and the Erdogan-Putin relationship are fascinating. I mean, as you say, you hesitate to describe it in these abstract terms because they're real people suffering. But it is interesting that they're both been very careful to maintain a relationship, even at moments of incredible stress, such as when the Turks shot down a Russian plane some years ago. It's said that when there was an attempted coup against Erdogan, Putin was the first on the phone to him, offering him help. And Turkey has stayed scrupulously neutral over the Ukraine war. It hasn't joined Western sanctions. Istanbul is, the place you can fly into Russia from. A lot of Russians are in Istanbul. And yet they are also clearly rivals. Azerbaijan is one area, probably, the premier area where, the Turks have taken advantage of Russian weakness, but they're also rivals in Libya, where they back different sides. I think, in a way, Erdogan's played his... And the other thing is that the Turks supplied the Ukrainians with their first generation of drones, which are actually named after Erdogan's son, the Bayraktar. So yeah, it's incredible in a way what Erdogan has managed to get away with what was, used to be, probably still is in some ways a very scary neighbor. But I think it is a sign that, Russia's just got too much on its plate, and Turkey is slightly expanding into the vacuum.
Yeah, Catherine, follow up on that, on what both Gideon and Ravi said, that Russia has a lot on its plate, and it just looks like this war is the externalities, the fact that half its army is destroyed, it can't afford to have another war anywhere else, is really fundamentally changing Russia's influence in let alone in the world, but really in its own immediate neighborhood.
Absolutely. I mean, I've just got back from Arctic Norway, and it's quite interesting up there that, discussing the geopolitics of the Arctic, is that this is in fact, the area in which NATO has most recently expanded with the accession of Finland to NATO, and soon, we assume, should Erdogan be up for it, that Sweden as well will join. And the Russian troops along that area have completely vanished. They're not there because they've had to go and back up Ukraine. I think the other lesson of what's happening in this situation is that frozen conflicts have a tendency to unfreeze at inconvenient moments. They are never resolved. They reignite at moments that may not be convenient for the players, external players that are involved. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's exactly right. And Ravi, I think the other thing we may be seeing is really the incompetence and impotence is probably the better word of international institutions. I mean, this used to be a conflict that was central in the OSCE back in the early 1990s. I don't think the OSCE is doing anything, certainly not there. The European Union was diplomatically involved. The United States has been We've had diplomats go over there, high-level diplomats, to try to resolve this, and none of it seems to have had any influence. And I'm not even mentioning the United Nations, of course. And it sort of feels like we're back into this world of where great powers do what they must, and the weak do as they have to. It's the other way around. Great powers do what they can, and the weak do what they must. As Thucydides in the Melian dialogue put it. I mean, it seems to be back in that way. And Azerbaijan just took the moment and said, "Hey, we're strong. Let's go do it."
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I feel like this is one of those things we should kick back at you, Ivo, to see your take on the diplomacy behind this over the years. But yeah, we are broadly entering a world now where which seems marked by great power competition, primarily between the United States and China. We seem like we're in a world where realism is back. Where transactional diplomacy seems to be the name of the game. And I think, when you have smaller countries that look at the way in which this world is headed, the way in which geopolitics seems to be headed, they're going to take advantage of that moment, whether it is picking and choosing who to ally with in a given moment, whether it is finding differences between great powers, and sort of in that interstitial space seeking to find little deals for themselves, whether it is trying to further their own agendas where they can, whether it is the rise of so-called mini-laterals or smaller groupings that seek to advance shared interests. That is the world that we're in, and I suspect we'll see more such unfreezings of different conflicts. I mean, history is up for grabs, really, in that sense. And much of this just stems back to the war in Ukraine. I think the world sees Russia as having its hands full. It sees America as largely preoccupied by not only the war in Ukraine, but competition with China. And multilateralism in this sort of arena seems to have failed us all. I mean, I think the United States, too, one could say, has begun to focus more on bilateral and regional agreements instead of putting all of its energies in old school multilateralism at the UN or elsewhere. And those are the failures we're beginning to see. That said, USAID is on the ground in Yerevan right now. I believe Samantha Power, the administrator, is there. A lot of the humanitarian arms will kick in, one hopes, and at least ease the worst of this refugee crisis. The humanitarian side of things, geopolitically, is another matter.
Yeah, Ravi, I think that's a really important last point, that we think about multilateralism and the international institutions primarily in geopolitical terms, and they've never been very strong. They've always been subject to the powers to be. But of course, they have also spawned a whole series of agencies and activities that deal with refugees, with human rights, with providing assistance and aid. And those agencies become more and more important, particularly in these kinds of situations, as they will be with the new flow of refugees. I guess I also, I agree with all of you that we are entering a different period in which the preoccupation of Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. preoccupation, frankly, with what's happening at home, as well as the competition abroad with with China, just enables countries to start projecting interests in a way they might have been deterred from doing before. And you get these kinds of activities, and the world in that sense, Ravi, as you put it, has fundamentally changed. The UN, we talked last week in the show about UNGA, and 4 of the 5 permanent members didn't even send their head of government or head of state. Modi, who wants to be a member of the Security Council, didn't come. It just showed you that nobody seems to care anymore about those things. But speaking, Gideon, of sort of trying to think about how to deal with the new world while having negotiations like the old world, this progress that seems to be made, a lot of talks by the Saudis, by the Israelis, by the United States, both publicly and now I guess the spokesperson for the Biden administration, Tom Friedman of the New York Times. That's unfair to Tom, but because he's more than that, he's also a good analyst. But he is being a conduit, no doubt, for the Biden administration. It seems things are moving. But they're moving in a way that we would have been thinking about the Middle East for the last 50 years, a big bang agreement with White House lawn handshakes. It seems that everybody wants that. The real question is, are we going to even get close to getting that? And if we do, what does it mean?
God, the White House lawn handshake. I hadn't even thought of that aspect, but it'd be quite a
This
scene.
is very important for
Netanyahu
president.
and MBS on the lawn. I thought MBS was meant to be a pariah, and and Netanyahu hates the Democrats, so it'd certainly be a scene. Yeah, I mean, it obviously is edging forward, and we now have it sort of not just from Tom Friedman, but from Mohammed bin Salman, who gave an interview to Fox News and said, it's getting closer and closer. Netanyahu has said the same. And the Biden administration is playing it down in public. Well, I mean, I guess Biden gave his interview, but they're not really hyping it up. But there's clearly a lot of activity going on. Jake Sullivan back and forth to the region, and we know the contours of the deal. The question is, do we like the deal? I don't think many people, other than real ultras on all sides, would object to Saudi-Israeli normalization because, it's better that two big important countries get on with each other and that commerce flows and, that's all great. But it's how it's brought about, I think, is particularly, do I say problematic? Potentially problematic for the United States because it involves, as far as we know, America giving a security guarantee to the Saudis, and also going along with a Saudi civil nuclear program. And it involves Israel making concessions to the Palestinians so that it can be sold to the Saudi public. Apparently 2% of whom I read are in favor of normalization with Israel. And I think each of those three elements is difficult. America does give security guarantees all over the world, but generally to democracies, to Japan and South Korea, the NATO countries. Does it want to give one to Saudi Arabia, which has an appalling human rights record, has recently initiated a war with Yemen, that has a very difficult relationship with Iran, that's always in danger of tipping over, that threatened Qatar? Are you then tied to Saudi foreign policy? That's one issue. Obviously, civil nuclear program, everyone raises their eyebrows to say, oh, well, where might that lead? Is that the basis of a Saudi bomb one day? And also on the Israeli stuff, I mean, it's because of the turmoil inside Israel, it's suddenly much more problematic to give Netanyahu a huge domestic win when half the country is accusing him of fundamentally undermining their democracy. And finally, do you really believe the Israeli guarantees that they'll give more to the Palestinians? Even bin Salman was just saying, oh, we'll kind of improve the lot of the Palestinians. And it seems to me the Israelis have made pledges like that before, around the time of the Oslo Accords, how you would actually hold them to it, and whether even if they made those things in good faith, whether they could deliver given the state of Israeli politics. So I think there's all of the details are questionable to me. And one thing you'd be in a better position to judge than me is, can it get through the Senate? I did an interview with Chris Murphy for my podcast, quick plug for that. And he's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Middle East Committee. And he said to me, I'm not a rebel. I back Biden on all sorts of difficult things, including the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But on this, he had real reservations for many of the, arguments I've just made were things that he put to me. He also said that, as he understands it, it's part of America's pushback against China's influence, because that's another question. I thought America was trying to do less in the Middle East. Now, why is it getting more involved? Partly, I think, because it's been spooked by the signs of rising Chinese influence, and this is a big pushback. But whether it actually permanently draws Saudi Arabia back to the kind of Western camp, or whether it's just the Saudis playing both sides is an interesting question. And so Murphy, I think, was not convinced, didn't sound to me like his vote was a shoo-in for that. So I don't know whether America would get this treaty through the Senate, even if they conclude it.
Yeah, no, certainly just on the U.S., there's a 67 votes you need in the Senate for a security commitment of a guarantee of some kind, and you would need a vote in both houses of Congress for what's called a 1-2-3 agreement on civil nuclear cooperation, and particularly since the Saudis want enrichment facilities, something the U.S. has not exported to any country since the 1970s. Those are going to be hard issues. But Catherine, I think Gideon lays it all out. There are really big questions for the Israelis, not just for Netanyahu, but in fact also for Netanyahu, because perhaps the concessions he needs to make are going to be problematical for his own coalition. And then he has the fact that he has hundreds of thousands of people on the street every Saturday, week in, week out. It's going to be hard for the United States and to get this through, and may not be that hard for the Saudis because it seems like they're going to get everything that they want, or at least that's the hope. But is it really going to change Saudi behavior in a way that we want to? Pick any of those or all of them, and sort of give us your take.
Well, I would say that, I mean, the irony is that Israel and the US are lucky to not be dealing with a democracy in the shape of Saudi Arabia, because they, although they have to be mindful of what their populace thinks of this deal, they are not going to be punished at the ballot box for it. So, you know, that's Gideon referenced the 2% of Saudi opinion that supported this. I think that's interesting. What is also interesting, and we don't know yet, is exactly what other concessions that are going to be putatively made to the Palestinians. What are they going to look like? I mean, they are the people who are going to get sold out here. Let's be in no doubt about that. There is really no kind of you know, there's no way for them to be part of this. That they're not an interlocutor. They're not. It's not like a peace deal in which you bring the sides together and talk about it. This is Tel Aviv to Riyadh. This conversation is happening. So that is interesting. Also, of course, I mean, Netanyahu is looking for a domestic win here to get Saudi relations normalized with Israel. To get that would be an incredible coup for him. But he's also facing these other issues, which is that in a very large part of Israeli society is rebelling against his attempts to bypass, you know, neuter, I suppose, the Supreme Court. And I think it just really demonstrates how difficult it is to make these kind of agreements in the Middle East actually stick beyond what you do on paper. I mean, Oslo, yes, in its parameters, in the sense of how it's happened to make governance on the ground and security zones on the ground work. You know, Oslo is still dominates the conflict, but it didn't lead where anyone wanted it to lead, except perhaps Israel, because it simply preserved a status quo. Where do these kind of agreements lead on the ground when you were talking about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's just hard to see how you move forward in a positive way. Ravi, pick up any part of it. I'm particularly interested in sort of the debate in Washington about this, because I've yet to meet anybody who thinks this is a good idea, other than the administration. I mean, even Tom Friedman argues he kind of sees this as a way to break up the Israeli government. And so it's really interesting that the administration is pushing this at a time when it's not really clear what is going to gain out of it, other than that White House lawn handshake, particularly if it won't stick.
And it's not even clear how desirable a big public White House lawn handshake could be in terms of PR. You know, there's a phrase that many White House officials have begun to use recently in interviews with me and others: variable geometry. And I feel like the Biden administration is playing a big game of variable geometry here. And I think, as with many things in DC these days, it is with one eye on China. I think if you look at why each side is pursuing this agreement, you know, for the Saudis, it's very clear. I think they have a lot to gain out of a security pact with the United States. They're seeking concessions on the Palestinian issue, which would be popular at home. And as Catherine pointed out, despite the fact that they don't have to care about popularity that much, but it is, a huge advance if you think about the fact that it's been unthinkable for decades for Saudi to think about normalizing relations with Israel. That's a big deal. Even during the Abraham Accords, when there was normalization with several Arab states, where it was generally popular to do so, Saudi's just been an outlier for long on that. So that's a big advance, but geopolitically, there's a lot in this for Saudi. For Israel, it's a bit more tenuous because it all depends on the concessions they would have to end up making towards the Palestinians, which could end up, as you pointed out, and Tom Friedman's pointed out, could end up hurting Netanyahu's coalition, which may be in America's strategic interest right now, or at least this administration's interests. That said, it is good for Israel longer term to normalize ties with a country that it's long sought to normalize ties with and take off the table as a threat. The last piece of this puzzle then is the United States. And this is where I think the variable geometry becomes, so vast and so big that it could play out in any number of ways. Instability in Israel could lead to another cycle of elections, which we've seen many of already. Imagine that through 2024 amid a US election cycle. That's a whole range of sort of unpredictability that could play out in any number of ways. A security guarantee for Saudi will not be popular in the United States, will be very difficult to push through Congress. And then one imagines then that the route and the means that the administration would seek to pass it would be China. You want to get anything done in DC, you say that this is a measure to constrain China. And that is likely the argument they would use ultimately in terms of trying to get Saudi on board. And this is where I worry about the ripple effects of US-China strategic competition, where you begin to, when you see the entire world through that prism, you begin to make choices that on the face of it, taken in isolation, could be questionable, could use up a lot of political capital, introduce all kinds of contradictions in the broader foreign policy objectives. Gone are any talk about human rights, democracies versus autocracies. All of those contradictions show up more starkly when you begin to see the world the way in which I think this administration is. So, big story. Who knows how it's going to play out?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's just fascinating that anybody would want to take this on at that particular time when you have a lot of other things going on. It just and if the hope is that the Saudis are going to turn against the Chinese, that's a hope not borne out by experience, given the increasing ties that the Saudis and the Chinese have, in part because of oil imports, which remains critical to the Saudis, and of course because they don't have quite dissimilar political systems. So although they're very different, they have singular leaders in control.
Just a quick footnote, Ivo. One thing, I had an interesting conversation with our correspondent in Tehran, and she said that she thought that one of the Saudis' motivations in doing the deal with Iran was to close off the possibility that Iran would rally opposition in the Muslim world against normalization with Israel, which hadn't struck me.
Yeah, anyway. and I think we all would agree that all other things being equal, that'd be great. The question is, what's the price to be paid for it? This bears watching. It's just a fascinating set of issues, and it's rare for administrations to embark on something big when it's not really clear that there is an immediate reason or problem that needs to be resolved, other than a very long-standing problem with so many different risks and opportunities. Speaking, however, Catherine, about problems and that do need to be addressed and are being addressed, Ukraine, which you, of course, follow closely, including very often inside the country itself. Zelensky was in New York one of his normal blistering speeches, then went to Washington. And that, let's put it this way, that was not, I think, the kind of visit he was hoping for. He didn't get a joint session of Congress speech. He did have a good meeting with President Biden. It's not clear what he got from President Biden. All kinds of reporting, but no announcements. And now, of course, he's back in Kyiv and meeting the French and British defense ministers and the NATO Secretary General. Where do you think he looks at the conflict? Where do you think he thinks this is moving, and what is he hoping to expect? And then, of course, what's happening on the ground? We've seen some real interesting recent advances by the Ukrainians that seem to have broken at least some of the defenses in recent weeks, and time's running out with fall and winter just around the corner.
Yeah, well, I'm going back next week to Ukraine, so I'll be able to tell you more about what's happening on the ground. I certainly think this is a very difficult moment for Ukraine and for Zelensky in all of this, because the what we were led to believe earlier this year was going to be a spring offensive, tipped into summer as it was. When it got underway, it has gone much, much slower than anyone would have wanted or expected. Now, I've heard multiple versions of, how that is viewed in the West, whether it is Ukraine's fault somehow. I personally think that it was an impossible ask without the kit that Ukraine was seeking all along, without air cover, that I think that no NATO country would be attempting to break through those kind of defenses without. So they've not had that. The sum total of this all is to say that, Ukraine has not managed to advance since it started this offensive in any meaningful way. It's crept forward incrementally, but it hasn't really penetrated these defenses that the Russians have dug and were able to put in place by being there just for so long. So I think it really underlines a question of, is Ukraine ever going to be able to take back the territory that the Russians have taken? I think there's a question mark over that. I think it is problematic. I personally, on the ground, wonder if they can. I'm not sure they can, and so that leads obviously Western backers to question the wisdom of their support. Now, you can question the wisdom and the support of their support in terms of saying they didn't give them the tools that they needed to do the job. They didn't give them air support. And maybe that's coming on stream. Supposedly there will be F-45s, but in the interim, what do you do as a backer of Ukraine? Do you start to suggest that maybe negotiations are appropriate? That's not even just because you're a backer of Ukraine. That could be influenced by the fact that you don't want Russia to come out of this with a win. What messages do you send? But it definitely is true that in Western democracies that support Ukraine, we are seeing a weakening of support amongst the democratically. We're seeing a weakening of support amongst the population, amongst the electorate, for continuing to spend a lot of money on arming Ukraine.
Yeah, and a lot of money has been spent. I just saw, I guess today in the paper, $230 billion has been spent by the Western world to support Ukraine, not just militarily. About 90 billion of that is military. The rest is economic and humanitarian. Useful reminder is that the United States has provided the lion's share, 100 billion of that, but that means 130 billion is being spent by other countries. And Ravi, there is a debate. Really, it's actually really happening in one party. It's not happening in the Democratic Party, but there is a debate in the Republican Party, and it's getting, it's tied up to our own internal budget machinations and whatever else you want to call it. I'm trying to restrain myself here on what's going on. But Ukraine is not as popular, certainly in the House, as it used to be, which was exemplified by Speaker McCarthy refusing to open up a joint session of Congress for Zelensky to speak.
Yeah, indeed. And you can call this past week's Republican debate to debate. You can call it a slanging match. But that's where we saw the divergence of views on aid for Ukraine on full display, where several prominent GOP frontrunners really feel like it is not in America's strategic interest to continue to give aid to Ukraine. Of course, there are others who were shouting them down at that debate, at least, and pointing out reasons for why it's important to support Ukraine. And as it's sort of a through line in this entire conversation, but the most used response tends to be, but we need to support Ukraine because of Taiwan and China. It all comes back to China. Just a couple of things here. I think, the administration could perhaps do a better job of explaining why helping Ukraine longer term, medium term at the very least, is in the country's strategic interests. I think getting people to care more, but getting them to understand how this would help America's interests, why it is in their interests, just demarcating more clearly that this is not just a fight of democracies and autocracies, but it's about sovereignty, which is something that everyone can get behind. I imagine that debate to intensify into next year. I imagine the Biden White House will try to strengthen its messaging around that as well. But I want to say one more thing about how we've all been assessing the counteroffensive. And, it's very clear now, for months we've been hearing rumblings from within the Biden White House about how the counteroffensive hasn't been going as planned. It's slower. Some decisions were made by the Ukrainians that were maybe suboptimal, directing, their best battalions to Bakhmut instead of other areas in the east, around Zaporizhia or towards the Sea of Azov, for example. And those criticisms may have merit, but I've been struck by one strand of thinking and argument by the likes of General Petraeus, who led the counteroffensive in Iraq. And he wrote a terrific piece recently in the Washington Post. He's also, quick plug, on FP Live, my podcast and show this coming week to expand on his argument. But his argument is that we keep thinking of wars as linear, in that they move in a single direction, or that there's an ebb and flow, when in reality, especially with counterinsurgencies, which he knows a lot about, it could be that Ukraine is imposing pressure on Russia's military across a wide stretch, holding back reserves, and that when there is a big breach or a series of breaches, then they'll commit the rest of their reserves and, actually be able to make significant advances. That is Petraeus's take. He was just in Kiev recently. And a growing number of military analysts seem to sort of subscribe to that theory as well, which is worth keeping in mind as we analyze the way in which this counteroffensive is playing out.
Yeah, I think that no doubt that this war has at times surprised everyone, and there's no reason to believe that it won't continue to. I just add that in today's New York Times, the actual paper, so somewhere before, I imagine online, there is a really interesting graphic on how much the front line has changed over the last 9 months, from January 1st to today. And it is 500 square kilometers has changed hands in across a 1,000 kilometer front line. So just think about that. It just isn't a lot compared to what it was in the first year, in 2022. compared to 2023. Doesn't mean it can't change, and I think Petraeus might well be right, but it is something that to watch closely. Gideon, in Europe, do you see the kinds of debates that are now emerging in the United States, at least within the Republican Party, on whether this is worth it or whether we should cut bait?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Although in Europe, that sort of cut the Ukrainians off argument is confined to the far right. I mean, maybe no coincidence. There's an overlap with the Republican Party, but so that would be Viktor Orban in Hungary. Could be Fico in Slovakia. Right. He may win this weekend in the Slovakian elections, which Slovakia is a small place. But if you have a group of countries around the EU table making those sorts of arguments, that's a bit of could be a bit of an issue. Polish-Ukrainian relations have become very strained, which is in a way a surprise, given that Poland was among the most ardent supporters of Ukraine and critical of the West for not doing enough. Suddenly they're blocking Ukrainian. But in terms of what the military and the more mainstream view of people who basically support Ukraine, I haven't heard much Petraeus-style optimism from the kind of European military folk. They seem to, and I think they would also acknowledge that wars surprise people all the time. Say, we don't know, but the central assumption seems to be that it's a deadlock, that the planes, even if they arrive next year, are not going to make that much difference at this stage. So people are beginning to talk about a political solution. And one scenario that was sketched out for me by, how can I put it, a European military person who goes to Kiev quite a lot, is that they've got to find a way of declaring victory, the Ukrainians. And so he said, if you can say that Ukraine gets a offer to begin negotiations with the EU to join in accession negotiations at the end of this year, then you look to the NATO summit in June, which is timed in a crucial moment in the American electoral cycle. It's in Washington. Maybe you could actually give them a pathway to NATO membership. At that point, you could say Ukraine's won. It's preserved its sovereignty. It's secured its place in the West. And in due course, in the great course of history, they'll get these other territories back. But for now, we're going to draw a line. That was the scenario that was sketched out for me.
Yeah, I think I'm no matter what happens on the military situation, even if Petraeus is right, unless the Russian army totally collapses, you're still going to be faced with a continuation of conflict. I'd go further. Even if Ukraine were able to reconquer every piece of territory, including Crimea, the conflict will continue because the Russians will want to subjugate their neighbor in Ukraine. It just may not happen this year or next year. And the only way to stop that, I think your European interlocutor is exactly right, is to fully integrate Ukraine into the West. That's how we did it with the Baltics. It's how we did it with the Poles. It's how we did it with other countries. And by the way, it's what the Ukrainians want, and it's not an unimportant consideration. In contrast to, say, 2004 or 2008 or 2012, when the Ukrainian population was divided, there's no division on this issue. Thank you, Vladimir Putin. So I couldn't agree more. And this is really not a war about territory. It's fundamentally a war about Ukraine's future. And the future lies with the West, or it doesn't. And that's how it ultimately will get resolved. Fascinating discussion, as always. I want to thank Gideon Rachman, Ravi Agrawal, and Catherine Philp for a really interesting conversation. We didn't solve problems, but we highlighted the issues that need to be discussed, and that's what we try to do each week on World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.